All right, so this is week 5 of our series on becoming a healthy disciple, and our theme today is a healthy disciple commits to loving and caring relationships. So a healthy disciple prioritizes genuine love for one another in the home, in the workplace, at church, and in the community. And 2 scriptures that illustrate this genuine and generous love are found in John chapter 12 and John chapter 15. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." If we can, I'd like to hold the John 15 text till I mention it. Great, thank you. If you want a clue about how significant this event in John chapter 12 was to the author of the 4th gospel, how about this? In John chapter 11, in verse 2, before Lazarus has been raised from the dead, and before Mary has anointed Jesus, as I just described, it says in John 11, verse 2, Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. That's mentioned in chapter 11 before it even happens. So it obviously had quite an impact on everyone who witnessed it. As we read through John's gospel, we don't know what John's referring to. If you're reading from the beginning, if you get to John 11, verse 2, and you're like, what is he talking about? Because you don't know, because it hasn't happened yet. So John 11:4 tells us that Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, and we know that they loved him too. And what Mary does in John chapter 12 is demonstrate extravagant love and care for Jesus in an impressive act of gratitude and worship. What Mary did in breaking open her alabaster jar was to lavishly anoint Jesus before his burial and to acknowledge him as the Messiah who would give his life for everyone. And so this is just an act of lavish love and generous giving. And Mary gave very unself-consciously. I'm guessing, use your imagination. Try to put yourself in a room where a dinner party is going on, right? And witnessing what Mary is doing. Come on, be honest. You'd be a little uncomfortable. I think most of us would be. A respectable woman in Palestine did not do such a thing. But Mary cared more about expressing her love for Jesus than for what people thought about her, and she derived great joy from what she did, and it's been told and remembered ever since. And how sad it is in life, conversely, when we have the opportunity to express love and care for someone, and then we fail to do so, and we have to live with our regret or our remorse later on, because that opportunity is gone and we never get it back. The value of the perfume that Mary used to anoint Jesus was the equivalent of 1 year's wages for an ordinary laborer. And so Mary's love expresses itself in great generosity. Judas' response, he tries to cloak his lack of love and care in the well-worn garment of self-righteousness as if he was supremely concerned for the poor. And Jesus' rebuke of Judas makes it clear that his objection did not come from a pure heart. It didn't come from genuine compassion for the poor. And when Jesus says, "You always have the poor with you," I think it's really important to note that is not an excuse to ignore the poor in our own time, nor is it an excuse to justify poverty. If you look at Mark's parallel version of this story, Jesus says you can show kindness to them, to the poor, whenever you wish, which is what we're supposed to do. But the question that leads to is, do we show kindness to the poor? What do we do with the alabaster jar in our possession? Because there's a sense in which we all have one, right? We all have an alabaster jar. The Lord has a unique role for each of us to play, and we all have to decide, what am I going to do with the alabaster jar, which represents all that I have, all that I am, the time, the resources that God has given me? Am I going to keep it on a shelf and save it for when I need it and use it just for myself, or am I willing to break it open and to share it with others? Vance Havner wrote, God uses broken things. Broken soil to produce a crop, broken clouds to produce rain, broken grain to give bread, broken bread to give strength. It is the broken alabaster box that gives forth perfume. If we've committed ourselves to Christ, then like Mary, we'll hold nothing back in our devotion to Him, no matter what the cost, no matter what other people think. And as we show and share the life and the love of Jesus through our lives, as cracked and banged up and weak as we may be at times, as we share in one another's joys and sorrows, Christ will be seen and God's love and care will be displayed in our midst. In John 15, I'd like to share that next scripture. Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And Jesus did exactly that. He laid down His life for His disciples and for everyone. And the kind of love Jesus is talking about, agape love, unconditional love that seeks the highest good of the other. That's what Jesus is talking about when He says, love one another. And each of us decides our response to Christ's sacrificial love for us and whether we'll share God's love with others. I sometimes try to imagine what would the world really be like if Christians all around the world were truly known for our love. What if all of our relationships were motivated by the kind of love that Jesus shows to us? Gary Chapman, in his best-selling book, The 5 Love Languages, suggests that each of us has a preferred love language, that we prefer to receive love from others. And we all need to give and receive love in different ways. And the 5 languages he talks about are words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, physical touch, and gifts. And when we're in, someone we love, whether it's a spouse, a family member, a child, a friend, we express love in all 5 of those ways, but we all kind of have 1 or 2 that speak more to us. And expressing a commitment to loving and caring relationships really kind of begins with knowing what is the primary love language of my child, my spouse, my friend. So how can I speak in that language so they know that they're loved? Just going to share 2 stories with you this morning. Last weekend, Jill and I and George and Ginny Haller and Elizabeth Covell were at a mission conference up in Leominster called Mission Works. It's a conference that our American Baptist churches put on every year. And this year, the theme involved hospitality and showing love to those who need it most. And on Saturday morning, a woman who was from Myanmar, which is east of Bangladesh and India, north of Thailand and Laos, shared the very painful and difficult story of the struggle of her Christian family to survive in Myanmar. And her father and her grandfather were both Baptist pastors. And many people in her village disappeared during the struggles that have gone on. And her father built a hole in the ground in which the family could hide when the soldiers came through their area. And every time the soldiers came, people disappeared. She had a brother who was autistic and not verbal, and one time the soldiers came through and they questioned him, and when he couldn't speak and couldn't answer, they beat her brother so badly that he died a short time later of his injuries. She went on to talk about how she and her husband and their 3 children began to care for a 4th child whose parents had both been killed. And they took him under their wings, and she's part of what's called the Karen people, and the Karen soldiers who were just volunteers, unpaid, mostly younger men trying to protect their own people, helped escort them through the jungle and over the mountains and got them to a refugee camp in Thailand. And the positive thing about being in the refugee camp was that they were safer. The more difficult thing was they couldn't rummage for food as they could do when they were in the jungle. And they were very grateful, she said, to the United Nations and the local people for the food to keep them alive. But there was no meat, there was no fish, there was no vegetables. And they didn't have money to pay for all the documentation they needed to go to Australia. And to shorten a much longer story, eventually they were able to complete all the paperwork, and after several years of praying, they were allowed to come into the United States. But the authorities wouldn't let them take the orphaned boy who they had been caring for and who had been living with them. They wouldn't let them take him because they didn't have the paperwork, they didn't all that sort of stuff. And here's the point to me about a commitment to loving and caring relationships. She and her husband made the decision that they and their 3 kids were not going to leave that boy alone in a refugee camp. Now think about that. You have the opportunity to get out of there as a family. And they stayed there for a little more than 2 full years in that refugee camp, working and trying to find the right, do everything they needed to do until they could finally get permission to take that boy with them so they wouldn't leave him alone. And Jill and I mean, everyone who was there was really touched. And a really cool part of the story was she talked about how much she prayed and how long she prayed for God to let them get out together. And she didn't get to pick a state to live in, but when they were sent to Massachusetts, she was ecstatic because her grandmother had used to tell her stories about how Adoniram Judson had come from Massachusetts and brought the gospel of salvation to what was then Burma. And so for her to come to the state that had sent the good news to her country was just such a tremendous blessing. And she's now a lay leader at the First Baptist Church in Worcester. I mean, it was just a tremendously powerful story about a commitment to loving and caring relationships. And I'm going to give you one more. And this is just, to me, a wonderful example that demonstrates a commitment to loving and caring relationships and a spirit of generous giving. A member of our church sent me this just the other day. A woman named Julie Morgan posted on Facebook the following story. She said, 25 years ago, we lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. We were young and money was tight, but every payday, Rick would pick up Steve's Pizza for dinner. I can't possibly describe how delicious this pizza is, but several moves and all these years later, it is still the gold standard, and we've never found a better pizza yet. Rich has frequently critiqued other pizza as good, but it's no Steve's. Well, Rich and I recently planned a weekend getaway to Michigan to celebrate my birthday. We talked about seeing the leaves and the lake shore, but that was secondary to our planned visit to Steve's. Instead, I took Rich to the ER, where he landed in ICU for 5 days, and where we learned the news that his valiant cancer battle was coming to an end. Rich is home under hospice care, and we are enjoying every minute, reminiscing and visiting with family and friends. Unbeknownst to us, my dad contacted Steve's Pizza and spoke to Dalton, a manager there. He told Dalton a little bit about our situation and asked if the shop might send a friendly text or a card to us. Without hesitation, Dalton asked what kind of pizza we wanted and told my father he would bring it to us. And by the way, Steve's doesn't deliver. My dad clarified that we were now in Indianapolis, at least 3.5 hours away from Battle Creek, Michigan. Dalton said he understood that, and he would leave after he closed the store. And so while Rich and I slept at 2:30 a.m., Dalton rolled into our driveway, left the car running, and delivered 2 extra special pizzas to my waiting family. He told them we were in his prayers and offered to help in any way he could. My dad offered to put him up in a hotel, but he refused and immediately left for the return trip because he had to work the next day. And she concluded, I am beyond overwhelmed and humbled by this act of genuine kindness. Dalton brought our family so much joy and the best pizza in the world at a really difficult time. While thank you hardly seems adequate, from the bottom of my heart, Thank you, Dalton, from Steve's Pizza in Battle Creek, Michigan, for making your epic middle-of-the-night pizza delivery. What a lovely act of generosity and caring for Dalton to drive 3.5 hours each way in the middle of the night to deliver 2 pizzas to a terminally ill man and his family he didn't even know. And what a wonderful thank you message from Julie Morgan that she shared not just with Dalton, but with the world. And I'm guessing the phone at Steve's Pizza in Battle Creek, Michigan, has probably been ringing off the hook a little bit this week as that story has gone viral on Facebook. Doing good, I suspect, will lead to even better business. Is there somebody you could write a note to express gratitude and thanks today? Doreen Mayer, who leads our spiritual formation ministry, has at least 200 note cards, correct? And she's going to be in the library when you leave the sanctuary. And if you're a leader of a small group and you want to take one for each member of your group and take some time to write notes when your group meets this week, or if you want to just grab one on the way out and write a thank you note to somebody, if you want to do it here, we'll even mail it for you tomorrow. But one of the ways that we show our commitment to loving and caring relationships is letting people know we appreciate them. One of the shows that's going to be at the Cape Playhouse in Dennis next summer is a chorus line. And there's some great songs in that musical, and one of them is What I Did for Love by Josh Groban. And it says in part, "Gone, love is never gone. As we travel on, love's," clearly a lot of you have not seen a chorus line, "love's what we'll remember. Love's what we'll remember. Won't forget, can't regret what I did for love." You won't forget, and other people won't forget what we do for love. I'm sure that Mary in John's Gospel didn't regret for a moment what she did for love for Jesus. Yesterday, I led a service here for Eileen Sprague, who passed away this summer at the age of 95, and when you listen to what her children and her grandchildren wrote and shared about Eileen, you know that it's true that love is never gone. And as we travel on, love is what we'll remember. We all leave a mark on the lives that we touch. Let it be a touch of love. Let's pray. Precious Lord, you have modeled extravagant love for us and those who knew you and loved you. In return, are role models for us today. May our lives embody some of those same characteristics so we too can be catalysts for extravagant love in our relationships within our family, our church, our circle of friends, our community, our school, and our workplace. We ask this in your name. Amen.